The wetness hit his cheek before he saw her. Jack Meridian froze in his saddle, one hand already reaching for the colt at his hip, the other tightening on the reins as his horse shifted beneath him. The moon hung full over the abandoned Whitmore ranch, casting silver shadows across the collapsed porch and broken windows. But it was the figure in white, standing motionless by the old well, that made his blood turn to ice water. She shouldn't exist. Everyone in Clearwater knew the story, had known it for 3 years running. Sarah Whitmore died the night her ranch burned, trapped in the flames while her husband lay bleeding in the dirt. The townspeople whispered about her restless spirit, about riders who claimed to see her wandering the ruins, about the way livestock refused to graze on land where the house once stood. But ghosts didn't cry, and Jack could feel the tear sliding down his cheek, warm and salt-bitter against his sun-weathered skin. The woman, or whatever she was, turned toward him with a movement so slow it seemed to defy the desert wind that rustled through the sage. Her dress, once white, hung in tatters around her bare feet. Her dark hair moved like water around shoulders that trembled with each shallow breath. When their eyes met across the moonlit distance, Jack felt something crack open in his chest. She was real, flesh and bone, and sorrow so deep it reached across 20 yards of empty ground to touch him. His horse nickered softly, ears pricked forward. Animals could sense the supernatural, his grandmother always said, but Ranger wasn't spooked. He was curious, the way he got around wounded creatures that needed tending. Sarah, the name escaped Jack's lips before he could stop it, barely a whisper in the desert silence. She took a step toward him, then another, her bare feet making no sound on the hard-packed earth. As she moved closer, Jack could see the dirt caked under her fingernails, the way her lips were cracked from thirst, the hollow hunger in her dark eyes that belonged to the living, not the dead. But she'd been gone 3 years. The whole town had searched the ashes. They'd found bones, teeth, the melted silver of her wedding ring. Another tear fell, this one landing on his hand as she stopped just within arm's reach of his horse. Her lips parted as if to speak, but only silence emerged, thick with desperation and a fear that made Jack's throat close tight. The wind picked up, carrying the scent of smoke and rain and something else, something that smelled like secrets buried too deep to dig up. Jack dismounted slow, his boots hitting the ground with deliberate care. Every instinct screamed at him to ride hard back to town, to forget what he'd seen, to let the dead stay buried. But Sarah Whitmore wasn't dead, couldn't be, not with the way she watched him with eyes that held too much pain for any spirit to carry. "You're supposed to be in the ground," he said quietly, his voice rough with confusion and something that might have been hope. She flinched as if the words were physical blows, wrapping her arms around herself. When she tried to speak, only a hoarse whisper emerged. Please, one word, but it carried the weight of 3 years' worth of silence. Jack had heard the stories. Hell, he'd helped spread some of them. How Richard Whitmore had lost his mind the night of the fire, claiming his wife had escaped, refusing to accept the evidence of her death. How they'd had to drag him away from the ruins, screaming her name. How he'd died 6 months later in the territorial asylum, still insisting she was alive somewhere, waiting for him to find her. The smart thing would be to mount up and ride, report what he'd seen to Sheriff Morrison, let the law sort it out. Because if Sarah Whitmore was alive, if she'd been alive all this time, then someone had been lying. Someone had let an entire town mourn a woman who wasn't dead, had let a man die believing his wife needed saving. But looking at her now, at the way she trembled, at the fear that rolled off her in waves, Jack knew she wasn't dangerous. She was terrified. "Who did this to you?" he asked, stepping closer. Sarah's eyes darted toward the ruins of the house, then back to his face. She opened her mouth, tried again to speak, but nothing came. Her throat worked like she was drowning on words that wouldn't surface. Jack pulled his canteen from his saddle, held it out to her. "Here." She stared at the water like it might be poison, then snatched it with shaking hands. The way she drank, desperate, grateful, told him everything he needed to know about the last 3 years of her life. "Sarah," he said gently, "where have you been?" Fear flashed across her features so sharp and sudden it made him take a step back. She thrust the canteen toward him, shaking her head violently, tears streaming down her cheeks. In the distance, Jack heard something that made his blood freeze. Hoofbeats. Multiple horses, riding hard toward the ranch. Sarah heard them too. Her whole body went rigid, her eyes wide with terror. She grabbed his arm, her fingers digging into his sleeve with desperate strength. When she looked up at him, he could see the plea written in every line of her face. Hide me. The riders were getting closer. Jack could make out voices now, men calling to each other in the darkness. One voice rose above the rest, familiar and cold. She's here somewhere. Fan out and find her. Sheriff Morrison. But why would the law be hunting a dead woman, unless she wasn't supposed to be found alive? Jack made his choice in the space between heartbeats. He grabbed Sarah's hand and pulled her toward the old root cellar, its wooden doors barely visible beneath 3 years of accumulated dust and tumbleweeds. The voices were getting closer. He could make out Morrison's deputy, Tom Brennan, and at least 2 others. She couldn't have gotten far. Morrison's voice carried across the night air. Not on foot, not in her condition. Sarah's fingers tightened on Jack's as they crouched in the darkness of the cellar. Above them, boot heels rang against the wooden porch, searching. Through the gaps in the cellar doors, Jack could see the dancing light of torches. Condition, he whispered against Sarah's ear. She pressed closer to him, her body trembling like a trapped animal. In the thin moonlight filtering through the cracks, he could see her lips moving, trying to form words that wouldn't come. The desperation in her eyes was answer enough. Whatever they'd done to her, whoever they were, she'd rather die than let them find her. Check the old buildings, Morrison called out. The barn, the smokehouse, and Tom. Yeah, Sheriff. If you find her, we do this quiet. Nobody else needs to know she was here. The words hit Jack like a physical blow. Morrison wasn't searching for an escaped ghost. He was hunting a woman who'd somehow survived what everyone believed had killed her. A woman whose very existence threatened something important enough to kill for. Heavy footsteps approached the root cellar. Sarah's breathing hitched, barely contained panic radiating from her in waves. Jack pressed his hand over her mouth gently, not to silence her but to steady her, to let her know she wasn't alone. The cellar doors groaned as someone tested them. Through the gap, Jack could see Tom Brennan's weathered face, torch held high. The deputy paused, studying the accumulated debris, then moved on. Nothing here, Brennan called out. Keep looking. Morrison's voice held an edge that spoke of desperation masked as authority. She's weak, can't have gone far. And remember, if anyone asks, we were chasing cattle rustlers tonight. The search continued for what felt like hours, but was probably 20 minutes. Finally the voices faded, the torchlight disappeared, and the sound of horses moved away toward town. Jack waited until the night fell completely silent before pushing open the cellar doors. Sarah collapsed against him the moment they emerged, her strength finally giving out. In the moonlight, he could see her more clearly now, the hollowness of her cheeks, the way her clothes hung on a frame that had once been fuller, the scars on her wrists that spoke of restraints. They kept you prisoner, he said. Not really a question. Sarah nodded, tears streaming down her face. She touched her throat, shook her head, then pointed toward town. They heard your voice. Another nod. Morrison, the fear that flashed across her features was answer enough. Jack helped her to her feet, his mind racing. Sheriff Morrison had been one of the men who'd searched for her body after the fire. He'd been the one to convince the town she was dead, the one who'd signed off on the burial of whatever bones they'd found in the ashes. But if Sarah was alive, if she'd been alive all along, then whose bones had they buried? And why would Morrison want the truth to stay hidden? The answers were written in every scar on Sarah's body, in every silent scream trapped in her ruined throat. Jack led Sarah to a sheltered spot among the rocks, away from the open ground where they might be seen. She moved like someone who'd forgotten how to trust, flinching at every shadow, every sound. When he offered her his coat, she stared at it for a long moment before accepting it, wrapping it around herself like armor. I need to get you somewhere safe, he said quietly, but first I need to understand what happened. Sarah looked toward the ruins of her house, then back at him. Slowly, painfully, she began to communicate, not with words, but with gestures, with expressions, with the language of desperate people who've learned to survive in silence. She pointed to herself, then to the house, home. Then she made the motion of flames, of running, fire, escape. Her hands flew to her throat, eyes wide with remembered terror, and Jack understood. She'd run that night, but someone had caught her. Morrison, he asked. She nodded, then held up 3 fingers. 3 years. She'd been his prisoner for 3 years. The pieces began to fall into place with sickening clarity. Richard Whitmore had discovered something, maybe seen something he shouldn't have. The fire hadn't been an accident, it had been meant to silence them both. But Sarah had escaped, and Morrison couldn't let her return to town with whatever secret she carried. Jack reached into his saddlebag and pulled out a piece of paper and pencil. "Can you write?" Sarah's eyes lit up, the first real hope he'd seen in them. She took the pencil with shaking hands and began to write, the letters shaky but legible. "He killed them. The gold, Richard found out." Jack stared at the words. What gold? More writing. Mine payroll. Morrison stealing. Richard saw. The territorial mine payroll. Thousands of dollars in gold that went missing 2 years before the fire. Morrison had led the investigation, claimed it was outlaws from Mexico. But if Richard Whitmore had discovered Morrison was behind the theft, Richard tried to tell Marshall. Morrison burned house, took me. Why keep you alive? Jack whispered. Sarah's hand trembled as she wrote, knew where Richard hid proof. Do you know where it is? She nodded, then pointed toward the old well. Even in the moonlight, Jack could see the determination in her eyes. She'd been planning this moment for 3 years, waiting for someone she could trust. Jack looked at this broken woman who'd survived 3 years of captivity, who'd endured horrors he could only imagine, and felt something fierce and protective rise in his chest. She'd been stronger than her captor knew, holding on to the one thing that could bring him to justice. "We'll get the proof," he said, "and we'll make sure everyone knows the truth." Sarah reached out then, her fingers touching his cheek, where her tear had first fallen. Her eyes were wet again, but this time with something other than fear. For the first time in 3 years, someone believed her. Someone was willing to fight for her. She leaned against him, just for a moment, allowing herself the luxury of human contact without fear. Jack felt the weight of her trust, the responsibility of it. She'd survived this long on hope alone, hope that someday someone would come who would listen, who would care enough to act, that someone was him, and he wouldn't let her down. But even as he held her, Jack knew Morrison would be back. Men like the sheriff didn't give up easily, especially when their freedom, their lives depended on keeping their secrets buried. They had maybe until dawn before the hunt resumed. The proof was exactly where Sarah said it would be, hidden in a waterproof pouch inside the old well, lowered on a rope and tucked into a crevice Richard Whitmore had carved into the stone. Jack hauled it up by lamplight while Sarah kept watch, her newly regained voice a hoarse whisper warning him when she heard anything suspicious. The documents were damning, payroll records in Morrison's handwriting, maps showing where he'd buried the gold, even a letter to his brother describing how he'd eliminated the problem of Richard and Sarah Whitmore. Richard had been thorough, methodical, building a case that would have sent Morrison to the gallows. "We take this to the territorial marshal," Jack said, securing the papers in his saddlebag. "Morrison won't be able to." The sound of approaching horses cut him off. They were out of time, but instead of running, Jack made a different choice. He helped Sarah onto his horse, then rode straight toward the sound, toward Morrison and his men. If they were going to end this, it would be in the open, with the truth as his weapon. They met on the main road to town, 4 men with drawn guns surrounding Jack and Sarah in the pre-dawn darkness. Morrison's face was a mask of cold fury when he saw Sarah clinging to Jack's back. "You should have minded your own business, Meridian," Morrison said, his voice deadly quiet, like Richard Whitmore should have minded his. Jack replied, "Funny how people who stumble onto your secrets keep having accidents." Morrison's gun never wavered. "Sarah's been sick, you understand, out of her mind with grief. Whatever she's told you, she doesn't need to tell me anything." Jack pulled the papers from his saddlebag, holding them high enough for all the men to see. "Richard already did that 3 years ago. Every detail of how you stole that gold, how you murdered him when he found out, The silence stretched taut as a bowstring. Morrison's deputies exchanged glances. They'd followed orders without asking questions, but murder and theft were different territory entirely. Tom, Sarah's voice cracked like breaking glass, but it carried across the desert air. You have a daughter, Emma. What if it was her? Deputy Brennan's gun hand began to shake. He'd known Sarah before the fire, had watched her teach Sunday school, had seen her kindness to every child in town including his own Emma. Sheriff, Brennan said slowly, maybe we should hear what she has to say. Morrison spun toward his deputy, desperation finally showing through his composed mask. She's insane, Tom. 3 years in the desert will do that to a person we can't trust. You kept her locked in your root cellar, Jack interrupted, fed her scraps, broke her voice so she couldn't scream. That's not desert madness, Morrison, that's your handiwork. The truth hung in the air like smoke. One by one Morrison's men lowered their weapons, the terrible logic of it settling into their minds. They'd helped hunt a victim, thinking they were chasing a ghost. Morrison raised his gun toward Sarah one last time, his face twisted with the fury of a cornered animal, but Jack was faster. His Colt cleared leather, and fired in the same motion, the bullet taking Morrison in the chest before the corrupt sheriff could pull his trigger. Morrison fell backward into the dust, his blood dark against the pale earth. With his dying breath, he looked at Sarah and whispered, "Should have stayed buried, but I didn't." Sarah replied, her ruined voice growing stronger with each word, "And now everyone will know." 2 years later, Jack Meridian stood in the doorway of the little house he'd built on the edge of clear water, watching his wife tend to her garden. Sarah's voice had never fully recovered, but she didn't need words to communicate the peace she'd found in small things, in watching things grow, in waking up each morning to sunlight instead of darkness, in the simple freedom of being alive. The territorial marshal had cleaned house after Morrison's death, rooting out corruption that ran deeper than anyone had imagined. The stolen gold was recovered and returned to its rightful owners. Sarah had testified at 3 trials, her whispered words carrying more weight than any prosecutor's argument. But it was the quiet moments Jack treasured most, like this one, watching her smile as she coaxed tomatoes from the hard desert soil. She looked up and caught him staring, her dark eyes bright with the kind of happiness that comes after surviving the impossible. "What?" she asked, her voice like wind through autumn leaves. "Just thinking," he replied. "They said you were a ghost." Sarah walked to him, her bare feet silent on the wooden porch, and placed her hand against his cheek, the same gesture she'd made that first night by the well. "I was," she said simply, "but you brought me back to life." In the distance, a red-tailed hawk circled high above the desert, its cry echoing across the vast openness where secrets had once been buried, but where truth had finally learned to flourish in the light.